The morning light crept across the skyline of New York City, brushing the Hudson River with strokes of silver and gold as Vail Technologies Tower woke to another day of relentless precision. Inside the top-floor office, Ethan Vail stood by the glass wall, his reflection merging with the city that mirrored his success. At 35, he had everything society told him he should want. His name appeared in Forbes. His empire shaped the future of artificial intelligence. His bank accounts overflowed. Yet every sunrise felt like another transaction he did not remember approving. He measured life in quarterly reports and acquisitions, not in moments or memories. When people spoke of joy, he thought of efficiency. When they mentioned love, he thought of distraction. The world had become an equation that no longer required his heart. His employees knew the rules by heart. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not miss deadlines. And never mistake his politeness for friendship. The silence that filled his office was the kind that made ambition sound like prayer. That week, a new secretary joined his schedule-driven universe. Clara Hensley, 28, calm voice, efficient movements, graceful in her restraint. Ethan noticed only that she never forgot appointments and never brought emotion into the room. She was precise to the minute, her handwriting clean, her tone soft but firm. There was something old-fashioned about her that unsettled him, though he could not explain why. Perhaps it was the way she smiled with genuine warmth at the janitor every morning, or how she thanked the coffee vendor downstairs by name. She existed in his periphery, professional yet human, in a way he no longer understood. On Friday, clouds gathered over Manhattan, heavy with the promise of rain. The office emptied as thunder whispered along the river, but Clara stayed late, finalizing documents for Monday's investor meeting. Ethan had already packed his laptop when lightning flashed across the skyline, painting her silhouette against the glass partition. "You should head out before it worsens," he said, not quite looking at her. She hesitated, the faintest smile touching her lips. "Just finishing the last folder, Mr. Vail. I will leave in a moment." 10 minutes later, the storm broke open. Wind howled rain, slammed against the tower, and Ethan saw Clara glance toward the windows nervously. "Leave it for Monday," he insisted, his tone clipped but protective in its own way. She nodded, gathered her things, and slipped a sealed folder into the top drawer of her desk before grabbing her coat. "I will finalize the printouts at home and bring them first thing Monday," she promised. "Be safe," he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. She smiled faintly before disappearing into the rain. Hours passed. The city drowned in thunder, and the tower grew silent except for the hum of distant generators. Ethan was preparing to leave when his phone buzzed. A message from the legal department flashed on screen. Urgent. Need signed hard copy of investor contract tonight. Without it, Monday's meeting cannot proceed. He frowned, scanning his mind for its location. Clara had mentioned that folder, the sealed one. He remembered her sliding it into her drawer just before leaving. There was nothing improper in retrieving it. She had entrusted it to the company, and deadlines were sacred. Ethan stepped out of his glass office, the polished floor reflecting the storm's pulse from outside. The building's emergency lights cast everything in muted gold. He crossed the quiet workspace and stopped at Clara's desk. Her chair was tucked neatly in. The faint scent of jasmine tea lingered in the air. He pulled the drawer open carefully. There it was, the folder labeled in her neat handwriting. He exhaled, relieved. But as he lifted it, something caught his eye beneath it, a corner of old paper, weathered and soft. He paused. Curiosity rare and unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Beneath the folder lay a small photograph, edges curled with age. He lifted it, expecting nothing significant, but the moment his eyes met the image, the breath left his body. A teenage girl laughing on a beach, her hair flying in the wind. Her hand intertwined with that of a boy beside her, himself. Ethan at 17, smiling the way he no longer remembered how. His heart pounded. He turned the photograph over with shaking hands. On the back, faded blue ink spelled words that time could not erase. Promise me you will still build the world you dream of for both of us. S. Sophie. Her name struck like lightning. Sophie Vale, his first love, the girl whose laughter once filled every plan he made, the one whose absence turned him into the man who stood here now powerful and hollow. How could Clara have this? How could this photograph survive 18 years only to appear in the drawer of a woman he barely knew? Outside thunder rolled again, deep and distant as if echoing the question. Ethan sank slowly into her chair, the leather sighing beneath his weight. The photograph trembled between his fingers. He traced the edge where time had blurred their smiles. Sophie's eyes stared back at him through the grain of old film alive again for a moment in the dim light. His throat tightened until breathing felt like betrayal. He pressed the photo against his chest, as if it could steady his heart. Sophie. He whispered the name, barely a sound. The rain intensified, slashing against the glass walls while the city blurred beyond the reflection of his face. For the first time in years, Ethan Vale felt the wall inside him crack. The armor he had built from silence, wealth, and work split open. The world tilted back toward memory, and everything he had buried began to rise. At 17, Ethan Vale had believed that love could change the shape of the world. He had grown up in a narrow brick building in Brooklyn, where the paint peeled from the windowsills and the smell of salt from the harbor drifted through cracked glass. His parents worked endless hours at a laundromat, saving every cent so their son could attend a decent school. Sophie Vale lived next door, her laughter spilling from the stairwell like sunlight. She was 16, barefoot more often than not, with hair the color of late summer wheat and eyes that refused to hide emotion. The first time she smiled at him across the street, the air felt new. She believed in wild dreams in a world where kindness could rebuild anything broken. They spent afternoons sketching impossible inventions. On the back of old newspapers, whispering plans for the future while sitting on rooftops. Ethan told her that someday he would build something lasting, something that mattered. She pressed a seashell bracelet onto his wrist and said softly, "Promise me you will build it for both of us." He had promised. Then one winter night, everything shattered. The phone call came while he was studying. Her parents' car had slid on black ice. Sophie did not survive. At the hospital, he stared at the empty hallway and the cold fluorescent light that made every face look unfamiliar. A doctor said she had died instantly, as if that made it easier. Ethan's heart had stopped that night and never learned to restart. The boy who once dreamed on rooftops vanished, replaced by a machine built to produce results. He graduated early, earned scholarships, studied until dawn, and never spoke her name again. He built Vale Technologies on the same relentless energy that once belonged to love. Every line of code, every merger, Every calculated victory was armor against the memory of that phone call. People called him a genius. Investors called him unstoppable. But Martha, the woman who had raised him after his parents passed, knew better. Sometimes she would find him standing at the window long after midnight, the city lights reflected in eyes that looked awake but dead. She would whisper, "Ethan, you can't live your whole life running from the warm things." He would answer with the same line every time, "Warm things melt steel." Now 18 years later, sitting in his silent penthouse, above the Hudson, Ethan felt that steel beginning to warp. The rain had followed him home from the office, whispering against the glass walls of his living room like ghosts asking to be let in. He placed the photograph on the marble table, the inked promise glowing faintly beneath the lamplight. "Promise me you will still build the world you dream of for both of us." The words dug under his ribs. He had built a world, indeed, one of glass concrete and silence, but not the one she had imagined. His reflection in the window looked like a stranger wearing his suit. He poured a drink, though it tasted of nothing, and tried to convince himself the picture was a coincidence. Maybe Clara had bought it at a thrift store or found it in an archive of Vale family articles. Yet something about the careful fold at the corner, the faint salt stain from Montauk's sea spray, told him this was not chance. The memory felt alive again, refusing to return to the coffin he had built. He touched his chest, startled to feel a pulse that hurt. Martha noticed the change the next morning when she arrived to prepare breakfast. She was in her 60s now, gentle eyes sharp with unspoken wisdom. "You didn't sleep," she said while pouring coffee. "You're pacing again." Ethan avoided her gaze. A file came up from the past. "It's nothing." Martha wiped her hands on a towel and looked at him as only someone who had loved him like a son could. "The past doesn't send files, dear. It sends lessons." He had no answer. He spent the day pretending to work signing contracts without reading them, forgetting the taste of lunch. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sophie's smile reflected in the rain streaks across the office window. By evening, he gave up the charade and sat alone on the edge of his bed. The penthouse felt enormous, sterile, filled with art he had never looked at. He remembered the way Sophie used to draw small hearts on napkins. When she was nervous, how she would tuck them into his pockets without him noticing. Once he had found one months later, the ink smudged, but the words intact, "Do not let the world make you cold." He had failed her in that too. The clock on the wall ticked through midnight. He thought of Clara, of her calm voice, and measured tone of how she treated everyone with quiet respect. He had barely spoken to her beyond schedules, yet something about her composure had always reminded him of something he could not name. Now he knew what it was. Grace, the same quiet grace Sophie carried when she laughed against the wind at Montauk. Ethan picked up the photo again, tracing the outline of his younger self. His fingers trembled. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, tears gathered behind his eyes but refused to fall. He did not cry. He only sat still until dawn crept in. Through the windows bathing the city in pale blue light. The storm had passed, but the ache remained. He dressed mechanically, tied his tie with perfect symmetry, and told himself he would forget this. He always did. Yet as he stepped into the elevator that morning, the ghost of salt air followed him. By the time he reached his office, he knew forgetting was no longer possible. He placed the photograph in his briefcase, not out of sentiment, but necessity, or so he told himself. But somewhere deep inside, the man who had forgotten to feel stirred awake, confused and blinking, trying to remember how sunlight once felt on his skin. Monday arrived with a sharp chill of early March, the kind that turned the Hudson into a ribbon of pale steel beneath a low sun. Ethan stepped into Vail Technologies' headquarters at 7:15. His routine intact, but his composure fractured in invisible places. The city pulsed outside, yet his thoughts remained anchored to the photograph, locked inside his briefcase. He had spent the weekend convincing himself to bury the discovery, to file it under coincidence, and move forward. But as he entered his office, the faint scent of jasmine drifted through the air again, and Clara Hensley's quiet voice greeted him from behind her desk. "Good morning, Mr. Vail. Your calendar's ready. The contracts for Lanson Holdings are printed, and the investor summary you requested is on your tablet." Her words were calm, efficient, every syllable balanced on professionalism. Ethan managed a nod, forcing his gaze to stay neutral. "Thank you, Clara." She smiled briefly, unaware of the storm she carried inside her drawer. When she looked down to type, a few strands of her chestnut hair slipped loose from the neat bun she always wore. For a fleeting second, he saw Sophie standing in the wind again, laughing, her hair catching sunlight instead of fluorescent light. He turned away before memory could betray his control. The morning unfolded as usual, calls, negotiations, a stream of data on screens, but Ethan found himself distracted. During a video meeting, he caught Clara humming softly under her breath. While organizing folders, the melody was faint but unmistakable. A song Sophie used to play on her father's old radio. Something about time and tides and promises. His chest tightened. He reminded himself that coincidences happened every day in a city of 8 million people. Still, when he glanced up, Clara met his eyes briefly, her expression kind but distant, as if sensing the weight of something she could not name. After lunch, while reviewing quarterly projections, Ethan noticed the pendant around her neck, a small seashell threaded on a silver chain worn smooth by age. His breath caught. Sophie had owned the same pendant one she found on the Montauk shore the summer before she died. He had teased her for wearing it to formal dinners, calling it childish, and she had answered, "It keeps the ocean close when the world feels too dry." Now, nearly 2 decades later, that same shell glimmered against Clara's collarbone. Ethan forced himself to focus on his spreadsheet, but the numbers blurred. When the day ended, he remained in the office long after others had gone, staring out at the city, until the lights blurred into constellations of confusion. He thought about the photo, about the shell, about the melody, about how Clara's eyes carried the same quiet resilience Sophie once had when she promised that love could survive loss. By Tuesday, he had accepted that he could not ignore the pattern. During a staff debrief, Clara mentioned casually that she had grown up in Montauk before moving to Manhattan for college. The words landed like a blow. Montauk, the same beach where Sophie's laughter still lived in his dreams. Ethan kept his expression calm, his voice steady, but something within him began to uncoil a thread of destiny he could neither follow nor cut. That night, sleep evaded him again. He sat at his piano, an instrument he had not touched in years, and found his fingers tracing the chords of that old song. The notes trembled in the air like ghosts. He imagined Sophie watching amused by his clumsy rhythm, and Clara standing somewhere between them, unknowingly holding both past and present in her quiet grace. The next morning, Clara arrived early. She carried 2 coffees instead of 1 and set one on his desk. "You looked tired yesterday, Mr. Vale. Thought you might need this." Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you, you didn't have to. I wanted to," she said simply. Her tone without flirtation or expectation, only kindness. He took a sip and realized it was black, no sugar, exactly how he drank it. No one had remembered that in years. For the rest of the day, he watched her more closely, not with suspicion, but with a growing fascination he could not rationalize. She had a gift for order, yet carried warmth wherever she went. She spoke gently to everyone, the janitor, the receptionist, the interns using their names as if they mattered. When she smiled, the air in the room changed. Ethan found himself lingering by her desk, once pretending to ask about a client file just to hear her voice again. As she reached for the folder, the seashell pendant slipped forward, catching the light. He stared at it, then at her, and something inside him cracked further. "That necklace," he said quietly, before realizing the words had escaped. Clara looked down at it, touching it fondly. It was my mother's. She said it once belonged to her niece, Sophie. She passed away when she was young." Ethan froze his hand, tightening around the folder. He forced a small nod, masking the tremor in his voice. "A beautiful piece." She smiled softly. "It is. My mom told me Sophie loved the ocean. Sometimes when I wear it, I feel like she's reminding me to breathe." He managed a faint reply before excusing himself, retreating to the solitude of his office, where the city's reflection pressed against the glass. The realization thudded through him like a heartbeat too loud to ignore. Clara was not a stranger. She was a thread woven through the same tapestry of fate that had once unraveled his world. He stared at the photograph on his desk drawer, the edges now fraying from his constant touch. The questions multiplied, demanding answers he was afraid to chase. How had fate drawn this line between them, after all these years, and what was he meant to do with it? Outside, the afternoon sky dimmed to gray rain, threatening again over the river. Inside, Ethan Vale felt the first true stirrings of something he had long forgotten, the fragile awareness of destiny whispering his name. Ethan spent the next few days moving through his own company, like a man watching life from behind glass. Every meeting, every contract, every handshake blurred into background noise against the persistent echo of one question that refused to fade. How could Clara Hensley carry so many traces of a past she never lived? The pendant, the photograph, the song, all threads from a tapestry he thought burned away years ago. Logic whispered coincidence, but something deeper whispered fate. By Thursday, his restraint began to crack. During lunch, when the office thinned out and the city sunlight softened through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he finally spoke. "Clara," he said gently, his voice quieter than usual. She looked up from her notes, eyebrows slightly raised. "Yes, Mr. Vale." He hesitated, aware of how inappropriate the question could sound, yet the truth pressed too hard against his ribs to stay hidden. "You said earlier this week that you grew up in Montauk. I used to know someone from there a long time ago. Her name was Sophie Vale. Did you ever happen to know her?" Clara blinked, and for a second, something undefinable crossed her face. A flicker of surprise, maybe recognition, maybe memory borrowed through stories. She set her pen down and folded her hands. Sophie Vale, she repeated softly as if tasting the name. Yes, she was my cousin, my mother's sister's daughter. Ethan's breath caught the air thinning between them. The clatter of distant keyboards and phones faded until only her voice remained. I never met her. Clara continued, her tone shifting to something reverent. She died before I was born, but my mom spoke of her often. She said Sophie was the kind of person who made every room feel lighter, that she loved the ocean more than anything. Her eyes softened, reflecting the same melancholy that had haunted Ethan for years. When my mother passed away 2 years ago, I found some of Sophie's things in a box. She kept in our attic old photos, letters, and that seashell necklace. I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. Her smile in those pictures reminded me that love still exists even when life doesn't go as planned. Ethan's world tilted slow and seismic. He looked down at the folder in his hands as if it might steady him, but his fingers trembled. The photograph in your desk, he said after a long silence, was of her and me. Clara's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly in disbelief. You knew her, she whispered. He nodded once, unable to form more words. For a moment the air between them felt sacred, like standing in the ruins of a cathedral, still echoing with prayers. We were children, Ethan said finally, his voice rough with memory. Teenagers, really. She was my best friend, my first love, and the reason I built everything I have now. When she died, I buried that version of myself. I thought the world had closed that chapter forever. Clara stared at him, her gaze steady, yet trembling at the edges. Then maybe this wasn't coincidence, she said quietly. Maybe you were meant to find that photograph again, not to reopen the wound, but to remember what you lost. Ethan's throat tightened. I spent years building a fortress so high that no one could reach me. You walked in and handed me a key without even knowing it. A faint smile ghosted across her lips. I wasn't trying to open anything, Mr. Vale. I was just trying to do my job. You did more than that, he murmured. He looked at her not as an employee, but as a bridge between past and present, between the man he had become and the boy he once was. In Clara's quiet composure, he saw the echo of Sophie's light, tempered by time, transformed into something mature and grounded. She wasn't a reflection of his lost love. She was the continuation of the promise Sophie had written all those years ago. Promise me you'll still build the world you dream of, for both of us. For the first time, Ethan wondered if Sophie's final words were not just about his work, but about his heart. Clara stood then, perhaps to escape the intensity of his gaze. Would you like me to order lunch for you? She asked, her tone polite again, anchoring the moment back in reality. Ethan nodded, grateful for the reprieve. Yes, thank you. When she turned to leave, he found himself speaking again, unable to stop the truth spilling out. Clara, he said softly. She paused. If your mother kept Sophie's things, does that mean you still have the box? Yes, she said. I couldn't throw it away. It's in my apartment. Ethan hesitated. Would you bring it sometime? Only if you're comfortable, of course. Clara studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity in his voice. I'll see what I can find, she said finally, then walked away, leaving him alone with the hum of the city and the ache of memories resurrected. That night, Ethan returned to his penthouse, but could not bring himself to turn on the lights. The skyline stretched before him like an ocean of glass. He pulled the photograph from his briefcase and set it beside a half-empty glass of scotch. He realized now that the universe had not simply placed the past in his path, it had delivered it through someone kind enough to carry it without knowing the weight. Clara Hensley had inherited more than a family relic. She had inherited the gentle courage Sophie once possessed. He closed his eyes, letting her words replay in his head. Maybe you were meant to find that photograph again, not to reopen the wound, but to remember what you lost. Somewhere deep inside, something began to thaw. The fortress that had protected him for 18 years no longer felt safe. It felt empty. And for the first time, Ethan Vale was not afraid of what might happen if he let it crumble. The following morning, the air in the office felt different, quieter, as if the walls themselves knew something unspoken had shifted between them. Ethan arrived early, yet Clara was already there, arranging folders with her usual precision. When she looked up and met his gaze, there was no awkwardness, only an awareness that they now shared a secret thread stretching back through time. He greeted her softly, his voice lacking its usual distance, and she smiled in return, small but genuine. Throughout the day, their interactions carried a subtle undercurrent, a rhythm both cautious and tender. She would hand him documents, her fingers brushing his briefly, and each accidental touch sent a spark through him that felt almost foreign after years of practiced detachment. During one meeting, Ethan found himself distracted by the sound of her laughter from the hallway light and effortless, and he realized with a strange ache that it had been years since laughter had existed within these walls. That evening, when most of the staff had gone home, Clara knocked lightly on his open door. "You asked about Sophie's things," she said, holding a small envelope. "I brought this." He rose slowly, unsure what to expect. She placed the envelope on his desk. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a letter written in Sophie's unmistakable handwriting. Ethan's breath caught as he read the date in the corner, July 2006, 2 months before the accident. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. The letter was short, written with the same looping script that used to trail across her notebooks. "Ethan, if I ever disappear before we finish building our world, promise you won't stop. Promise you'll still find someone who believes in what we dreamed of. I hope she finds you when you've forgotten how to feel." His chest constricted, the words burning into him. Clara watched quietly from across the desk, not intruding. After a moment, he whispered, "She wrote this before the accident." Then maybe she knew, Clara said softly. "Some people feel the end coming before it arrives." Her eyes shone with sympathy, not pity, and something about that difference made Ethan trust her more. He refolded the letter with care, placing it back into the envelope as though returning a soul to rest. "You have no idea what this means," he said, his voice hoarse. "I think I do," she replied gently. "I lost my mother not long ago. Grief doesn't vanish, it only changes shape. Sometimes it takes human form." He looked at her, then really looked, and saw the quiet sorrow beneath her calm. "You've lost someone too," he murmured. She nodded. "Yes, but she taught me the same lesson your Sophie seems to have taught you. Love isn't just something we feel, it's something we carry forward." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The city lights reflected across the polished desk, scattering patterns on the walls. Ethan felt the years between his 17-year-old self and the man he had become collapse into a single fragile moment. "Clara," he said finally, "how do you keep believing after losing everything that once defined you?" She smiled faintly. I don't know if I believe all the time, but I keep showing up. Some days that's all faith is, showing up anyway." Her words stayed with him long after she left for the evening. He sat in his chair reading Sophie's letter again and again, feeling a strange blend of sorrow and gratitude. The ghosts that had once haunted him no longer felt like chains. They felt like whispers guiding him somewhere new. Over the next weeks, their connection deepened in quiet, unintentional ways. They shared lunch breaks more often, conversations stretching from weather to childhood memories to things neither had spoken aloud before. Ethan found himself telling her about his parents, about the nights he used to spend coding on a second-hand computer, about the loneliness that success never cured. Clara listened with that same undemanding presence that made him feel safe enough to be human. In return, she spoke about her mother's illness, about taking care of her while working 2 jobs, about the silence that followed her death. When she spoke, her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes remained clear. After she was gone, she said, "I realized I had spent years being strong for someone else and didn't know how to stop. I guess we both forgot how to be anything but functional." "Maybe we were both waiting for permission," Ethan said quietly, "to stop surviving and start living." She looked at him, surprised by his vulnerability. "And who gives us that permission?" He smiled for the first time in years, the kind that reached his eyes. "Maybe we do." That evening, as they worked late again, the office bathed in the golden hue of the setting sun, Ethan found himself watching the light play across Clara's face. It reminded him of Sophie's laughter on the beach. Yes, but it was not the same. This was steadier, deeper, a calm warmth that asked for nothing but honesty. For the first time, he realized he could remember Sophie without drowning in sorrow. He could think of her and still feel alive. Clara looked up from her desk, catching his gaze. "What is it?" she asked softly. He shook his head, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. "Nothing, just thank you." She tilted her head, puzzled, but smiling back. "For what? For reminding me that people are still kind." She blushed lightly, lowering her eyes. "Kindness isn't a choice for me, Mr. Vale. It's survival." When she left that night, Ethan lingered by the window, long after the city glittering below, like 1,000 small promises waiting to be kept. For the first time in 18 years, he felt the weight of ghosts begin to lift. Sophie was still with him, but no longer as grief. She existed now as guidance, as a light refracted through another person's presence. The past had stopped haunting, it had started healing. A week later, as a soft drizzle misted over Manhattan, Clara appeared at Ethan's office door carrying a small wooden box no larger than a shoebox, its corners worn and the latch slightly rusted. She held it carefully, almost reverently, and her eyes carried that mixture of hesitation and resolve that told him this moment mattered. "I found the box I told you about," she said quietly. "I think it belongs to you." Ethan rose from his chair, slowly, his pulse quickening at the sight. The box looked simple, yet something about it seemed alive with memory. He gestured for her to come, in his voice softer than usual. "Please sit." She placed the box gently on his desk and folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't look inside," she said. "I thought it should be you." Ethan stared at the box for several seconds before unlatching the metal clasp. The lid creaked open, releasing a faint scent of salt and old paper, as if the sea itself had been sealed inside for safekeeping. Inside lay a collection of small ordinary things, that suddenly felt sacred. A seashell bracelet, its threads slightly frayed but still strong. A folded piece of paper wrapped in a ribbon. A sketch, his sketch from years ago, drawn in Sophie's pencil strokes, showing him sitting on the beach, his face turned toward the ocean. His breath hitched. Clara said nothing, only watched with quiet empathy. Ethan picked up the bracelet first. The shells were smooth and pale, polished by years of waves. He remembered Sophie making it that summer, threading the shells together while sitting cross-legged on the sand. "It's for luck," she had said, "and so you never forget where you began." He swallowed hard, the memory so vivid it hurt. Next, he untied the ribbon from the folded paper and opened it carefully. It was a letter written in Sophie's familiar looping hand, the ink faded but legible. "Ethan, if I don't make it to see everything we planned, promise me you'll still build it. Promise you'll find someone who makes you feel like home again. Don't lock your heart away. The world doesn't need another genius. It needs someone who remembers how to love." He read the words twice before he could breathe again. The letter trembled in his hands. Clara reached across the desk, her fingers brushing his wrist, lightly grounding him in the present. "She really loved you," she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly, voice barely audible. "And I never told her enough. I thought I had time." The rain outside thickened, streaking the glass in long, trembling lines that mirrored the ache in his chest. He placed the letter back in the box, careful not to disturb the order Sophie had left behind. "How did this end up with your mother?" he asked finally. Clara hesitated. "My mom was very close to Sophie's mother. When Sophie died, her mom couldn't bear to keep these things in the house. She gave them to my mom for safekeeping, said maybe one day someone would know what to do with them. After my mom passed, I found this box and couldn't let it go. Something about it felt unfinished." Ethan looked at her realization, dawning slowly, like sunlight through clouds. "You were meant to find it," he said, "and to bring it back." Clara's eyes shimmered. Maybe. Or maybe we both just needed to remember someone who believed love could outlive time. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the city faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of rain and heartbeats. Then Ethan closed the box gently and stood. "There's somewhere I need to go," he said. Clara rose as well. "Do you want company?" He hesitated, then nodded, yes. 2 hours later, they were driving toward Montauk, in silence, the highway stretching endlessly beneath the gray sky. The ocean air grew stronger with every mile, mingling with the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. When they reached the familiar stretch of beach, Ethan parked and stepped out. The wind was sharp, carrying the sound of waves crashing against rocks. He walked slowly toward the shoreline, the wooden box clutched in his hands. Clara followed a few steps behind, giving him space, yet close enough to be felt. Ethan knelt at the water's edge, opened the box once more, and removed the seashell bracelet. He placed it gently on the wet sand, the tide rushing close enough to kiss its edge. "I kept my promise," he whispered, voice breaking. "Just late." The wind carried his words away, scattering them like prayers. He stood there for a long time, watching the waves erase the footprints around him. Behind him, Clara's voice came softly through the sound of the sea. "You know," she said, "I think she'd be proud. You built your world. And somehow you found your way home again." Ethan turned to face her. The wind tangled her hair, the rain misted her face, and in that moment she looked like the continuation of a story he had once believed ended too soon. "You make it sound like fate," he said. Clara smiled faintly. Maybe it is. Or maybe she just left a map. They stood together in silence until the rain eased and the clouds began to break apart. The sunset bled through a thin band of gold reflecting across the water. Ethan felt lighter, as if the years of guilt and silence had finally dissolved into the sea. He closed the box and carried it back to the car, the sound of waves following him like applause. When they returned to the city that night, the air felt different, cleaner. Ethan placed the box on his mantle, not as a relic of loss, but as a reminder of grace. He realized then that grief, like the ocean, never truly disappears. It simply changes tides. And sometimes when the water recedes, it leaves behind something unexpected, a new beginning, waiting quietly in the sand. Back in Manhattan, the days that followed moved in a fragile calm that neither Ethan nor Clara dared to break. Something between them had changed quietly since the trip to Montauk. Ethan found himself glancing toward her desk, more often than he should, catching the soft curve of her smile. As she worked, noticing how her voice steadied him when the chaos of business tried to pull him back into old patterns. He had spent years building walls that no one could climb yet. Now he felt those walls thinning each time she looked at him with that calm compassion. Still guilt haunted him like the echo of an old storm. Was he betraying Sophie by feeling warmth again? Every time he allowed himself to smile, he remembered the promise he made on the beach long ago, and wondered if loving again meant breaking it. The question followed him through sleepless nights, until one late evening when fate answered with thunder. It was a Thursday in April when a sudden power outage struck the tower. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the building fell into semi-darkness, emergency lamps glowing faintly along the hallways. Most of the staff had already gone home. Only Ethan and Clara remained finishing a client proposal due the next morning. The rain outside turned ferocious, tapping the glass walls like impatient fingers. Clara looked up from her laptop, startled. "That's quite a storm," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet. Ethan nodded, standing by the window as lightning lit the skyline in a flash of white. "Seems the city's reminding us who's really in charge." He turned back and saw her smile faintly in the dim light, that unshaken steadiness he had come to rely on. When the building generator kicked in, a low hum filled the silence, but only a few lights returned, just enough to paint the room in gold and shadow. Clara rose, walking toward the small kitchenette. "We might be stuck here a while," she said, filling the kettle from a bottle of water. "I'll make tea." "You don't have to," he replied automatically. "I want to," she said simply. The same answer she had given the morning she brought him coffee weeks ago. They sat together at the conference table while rain thundered against the glass. The steam from the tea fogged the edges of their cups, the smell of jasmine rising between them. Ethan stared into the amber liquid and said quietly, "You remind me of her sometimes." Clara didn't flinch. "Sophie." He nodded. "But not because you're alike. It's more like you carry the same light. Softer maybe, but just as real." She looked down, fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "You don't have to feel guilty for that, Ethan." Hearing his name in her voice startled him. It was the first time she had used it. "Guilty?" he asked. For moving forward, she said gently, "You loved someone. That doesn't vanish. But love isn't a museum piece you have to protect from dust. It's supposed to breathe." Her words hit him with the force of truth. He looked at her in the half-light, at the way her eyes reflected the faint glow from the window. "I've spent years making sure nothing touched me," he said. "It's how I survived. Maybe surviving isn't enough anymore," she whispered. "Maybe you're meant to live." The room fell quiet, except for the rain. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. Ethan reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was small, accidental, yet it felt monumental, like the first heartbeat after resuscitation. He didn't lean closer, didn't cross the fragile line between them, but the silence between their joined hands carried the weight of everything unspoken. "You can't stay frozen for someone who wanted you to live," she said, her voice trembling now, not from fear but emotion. "If Sophie really loved you, she wouldn't want her memory to cage you." Ethan exhaled a sound, halfway between a sigh and surrender. "Maybe I needed her cousin to remind me what living feels like." Their eyes met, and for an instant, the ghosts of the past and the promise of the future collided. A flash of lightning illuminated the office, catching them in a frame of stillness that felt almost sacred. The thunder rolled seconds later, deep and long as if sealing the moment. Then Clara withdrew her hand, gently breaking the spell. "The tea's getting cold," she said softly. Ethan nodded, forcing a small smile. "So it is." They finished their tea in silence, both aware that something irreversible had begun. When the storm finally eased and the lights flickered back to life, Ethan walked her to the elevator. The air between them was charged yet peaceful. "Thank you," he said as the doors slid open. "For staying tonight." "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "I'm just glad you're not afraid of the rain anymore." Her smile lingered even after the elevator closed, leaving Ethan standing in the corridor, his reflection split across the mirrored walls. That night he returned home and stood on his balcony, watching the remnants of the storm drift across the sky. The air smelled clean electric. He realized that guilt and grief were not opposites of love, they were its shadows. And shadows only existed where light dared to return. He closed his eyes, hearing her words again. "You can't stay frozen for someone who wanted you to live." The sentence repeated itself until it became something like prayer. He thought of Sophie, not as the ghost who had haunted him, but as the guardian who had led him here. She hadn't been replaced, she had been fulfilled. Somewhere between thunder and silence, Ethan Vale understood that the heart's purpose was not to remain unbroken, but to learn how to beat again. The morning after the storm, New York glowed with that washed clean light that follows heavy rain, the kind that makes even steel and glass look forgiving. Ethan arrived at the office later than usual, his mind still somewhere between last night's silence and the echo of Clara's words. When he stepped through the glass doors, he found her already at her desk, sunlight catching the small seashell pendant at her throat. She looked up and smiled, soft, unspoken understanding passing between them without the need for words. The world outside hummed with the rhythm of ordinary life, but inside something profound had settled. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like a stranger in his own company. The day passed in quiet harmony, filled with brief exchanges and the gentle music of routine. Yet beneath the calm, an ache remained, a longing for closure that no conversation could give. That evening, as the city lights began to rise like a second sky, Ethan made a decision. He texted Clara simply, "Meet me tomorrow morning. Montauk, 7. She didn't reply right away, but he saw the small reed mark appear beneath the message, and that was enough. The next morning, the air on the coast was cool and heavy with sea mist. Ethan waited by the car, the wooden box from weeks ago, resting on the passenger seat. When Clara arrived, dressed in a pale sweater and jeans, she smiled shyly but didn't ask questions. They walked together in silence across the damp sand until they reached the small rise overlooking the water. The ocean stretched endlessly ahead, silver and alive waves, curling and breaking like the sound of breathing. Ethan set the box down and knelt brushing the sand away from a small plaque embedded in the earth. Sophie Vale, 1989-2006, loved beyond time. Clara's breath caught, and she lowered her gaze respectfully. "You never told me there was a grave here," she murmured. "I couldn't," he said quietly. "I wasn't ready to see it myself." The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the smell of salt and memory. He reached into the box and took out the seashell bracelet, now dry from the night he had left it on the shore. "This belonged to her," he said, voice breaking slightly. "She made it the summer we promised each other the world." Clara stepped closer, her presence steady but unobtrusive. Ethan placed the bracelet at the base of the plaque, then laid the photograph beside it. The corners curled, but faces still clear, the laughing boy and girl frozen in sunlight that would never fade. "Thank you for sending me her," he whispered, his words carried away by the wind. Clara knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Together they stood there for a long time, listening to the waves and the gulls and the quiet that exists only in places where love once lived. When Ethan finally spoke again, his voice was steadier. "For years I thought coming here would hurt too much, but it feels right, like she's not gone just lighter." Clara smiled faintly. "Maybe letting go isn't the same as losing. Maybe it's just giving them room to stay differently." He turned toward her, meeting her eyes, and in that look, something inside him shifted completely. The grief that had once ruled him no longer demanded devotion. It simply asked to be honored. He realized he could keep Sophie's memory without keeping his heart buried beside her. "She'd like you," he said softly. "She'd see what I see." Clara blinked, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What do you see, Ethan?" He hesitated, then answered honestly. "Peace, the kind I forgot existed." They walked along the shore afterward, their conversation flowing easily, a laughter surfacing in between recollections. At one point, Clara slipped off her shoes and let the water wash over her feet. "It's cold," she said with a laugh, looking back at him, "but it feels alive." Ethan smiled, the expression unfamiliar yet natural. Maybe that's the point. As they drove back to the city, the silence between them was warm, filled with quiet trust. The skyline appeared again at dusk, and for the first time it didn't feel like a cage. That night, Ethan invited Clara to dinner at his penthouse. She hesitated at first, but agreed when he promised to cook. The result was predictably disastrous. The pasta overcooked, the sauce uneven. But Clara laughed so hard she nearly spilled her wine. "You really built an empire," she teased, "but can't conquer a stove." "Some challenges are beyond technology," he admitted, laughing too. They ate together by the window, overlooking the Hudson, the city glowing below like a constellation that finally made sense. For once, Ethan didn't feel alone in his success. He didn't feel like a man haunted by what he'd lost, but one blessed by what he'd been given again. After dinner, Clara wandered to the piano in the corner. "You play?" she asked. "Not in years," he said. "You should," she urged gently. It's still in you. He sat down hesitantly, pressing a single key. The note rang out pure and trembling, and then another followed, forming the melody Sophie once loved. Without realizing it, Clara began to hum along. The harmony filled the room like a prayer whispered to no one and heard by everyone. When the last note faded, Ethan looked up at her, the soft glow of the lamp catching her face. "Thank you," he said again, the words deeper this time, heavier with meaning. "For everything." Clara shook her head. "You don't owe me thanks, Ethan. You just needed to remember you were human." Later, when she left, he stood by the window, long after the reflection of her departing silhouette lingering in the glass. The city slept below, and the river shimmered under moonlight. Ethan Vale finally felt what he had been chasing all his life. Not success, not redemption, but peace. And as he closed the balcony doors, he whispered into the night, "Goodbye, Sophie. I kept my promise." The weeks that followed moved with a gentler rhythm, as if time itself had softened around them. Ethan arrived at work earlier these days, not out of habit, but out of quiet anticipation. The office, once a cold monument to his ambition, now breathed differently. There were fresh flowers on the reception desk, sunlight streaming through the windows without being shut out by blinds, and the faint sound of Clara humming while she worked a sound that grounded the building more effectively than any foundation. Ethan had begun to change in ways his employees noticed before he did. He no longer barked orders or hid behind clipped sentences. Instead, he asked questions, listened, and remembered names. He smiled when people entered the room. He had even introduced Human Fridays, a ridiculous term, coined by Clara when the team could leave early and do something for themselves. To everyone's surprise, productivity soared. But beyond the company's renewed spirit, something deeper had taken root. Ethan had started the Vale Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping young people who had lost parents or partners to illness or accidents, a tribute to Sophie's memory, though he never said her name publicly. When Clara read the first mission statement draft, she looked up from the paper with tears shining in her eyes. "She'd be proud of this," she said softly. Ethan smiled, the corners of his eyes creasing. "She gave me the idea. You gave it form." Together they spent long nights finalizing the foundation's plans, poring over documents and stories that reminded them both of why they cared. It was during one of those nights, as the city's lights flickered like distant stars, that Ethan realized he had stopped measuring time in losses. He looked across the desk at Clara, her face lit by the glow of her laptop, and thought, this is what healing looks like. Quiet, patient, alive. A few months later, Clara graduated from her evening design program, a pursuit she had postponed for years while caring for her mother. Ethan insisted on attending the ceremony, sitting discreetly in the back of the auditorium. When her name was called, he applauded louder than anyone else. Afterward, they walked along the riverfront, the spring air fragrant with lilacs. Clara carried her diploma rolled tightly in her hand, laughing when the breeze tried to steal it away. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I wanted to," he replied simply. "You've spent years taking care of everyone else. It was time someone showed up for you." She glanced at him, a smile forming that made something inside him expand quietly. They stopped at the railing overlooking the water. "What will you do now?" he asked. Clara thought for a moment. "Keep learning, I suppose. Maybe design something meaningful, spaces that feel like home for people who think they've lost theirs." He nodded, admiring not just her words, but the courage beneath them. I think you already do that, Clara. Every room you walk into feels a little more like home. She blushed, brushing her hair behind her ear, and the moment lingered delicate, fragile, waiting for acknowledgement. Neither was quite ready to speak. That summer they returned to Montauk together to check on the memorial site. The beach was quiet, the sea calm under a pale blue sky. Ethan brought fresh flowers. Clara brought the same wooden box, now empty, except for a few sand grains and the faint scent of salt. They sat for a while, saying little. Finally, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a repaired version of Sophie's seashell bracelet. Its thread replaced its shells, polished back to soft luster. "It's not a replacement," he said, his voice steady but low. "It's a reminder that love doesn't die, it transforms." Clara's eyes filled as he slipped the bracelet gently onto her wrist. "Then let's live what she wished for," she whispered. The tide rolled in, warm around their ankles, and the horizon opened like a promise. Back in the city, life continued, but with new color. Ethan found himself embracing things he once dismissed as frivolous music, laughter, Sunday mornings with no agenda. He played piano again, sometimes with Clara beside him, her voice blending with the notes in a way that made even silence sound beautiful. He learned to cook properly under her teasing supervision, and once managed a meal so edible that she declared it miraculous. In return, Clara learned to delegate at work instead of carrying the weight of perfection. They balanced each other, his precision grounding her empathy, her warmth softening his edges. Yet beneath the laughter and shared dinners, there remained a quiet understanding between them. What they shared had been born not out of convenience or proximity, but out of something deeper. Two hearts recognizing the same melody after years of silence. One evening in late August, as the sun dipped over the Hudson, Ethan found himself staring at the skyline from his office balcony. Clara joined him, holding 2 glasses of wine. "To the new foundation," she said, handing him one. "To the future," he replied, clinking his glass gently against hers. They stood side by side as the city hummed below. "You know," he said, after a moment, "I used to think love was about possession, about holding on. Now I think it's about presence." She looked at him curiously. "And what are you present for now?" He turned to face her fully, his expression open, unguarded. "You, us, whatever comes next." For the first time, she didn't look away. The sunset painted her face in gold, and something wordless passed between them, a promise, written not in ink but in breath. As the night settled around them, Ethan realized that he no longer lived haunted by what he had lost. He lived inspired by what remained. The world had not returned Sophie to him, but it had given him someone who carried the same spirit forward, someone who had reminded him that love, like the sea, doesn't end. It only changes depth. A year later, the skyline of New York shimmered under an early autumn morning, the kind of morning where the city's noise blended softly with the hum of renewal. Vale Technologies had changed just as much as the man who built it. The glass tower that once reflected only ambition now reflected something warmer: hope, compassion, life. The marble floors were still immaculate, the structure still precise. But laughter traveled through the corridors now. Ethan had replaced the sterile gray tones of the lobby with soft greens and artwork made by local children, sponsored by his foundation. There were open spaces where employees could breathe, talk, dream. Even the air seemed lighter. Ethan Vale, once the man the press called the Machine of Manhattan, was no longer a ghost of his own success. He still wore his tailored suits, but he smiled more, and when people greeted him, he answered with genuine warmth. On his desk sat the photograph that had started it all framed and placed beside a small pot of white orchids Clara had brought from her apartment. It no longer haunted him, it humbled him. That morning he was preparing for an interview with a magazine running a feature titled Billionaires Who Give Back. Normally he would have dismissed it as fluff, but this one felt different. It wasn't about power, it was about purpose. Clara entered the office just before the interviewer arrived, her clipboard in hand, her hair pinned neatly as always, though a few strands had escaped and framed her face. She was still his secretary officially, but everyone in the building knew they were far more than colleagues now. They moved together like two melodies woven into the same song, unhurried, certain, quietly intertwined. "You have 5 minutes," she said, with a small smile, placing a cup of coffee on his desk. "And please try not to overthink your answers. You always sound more human when you forget to be perfect." He chuckled, standing to adjust his tie. "That's your influence, I suppose." She tilted her head, teasing. "Then I'll take full credit when they call you the warmest billionaire in New York." "You already do," he said softly, and she flushed just slightly before excusing herself. The interviewer arrived soon after, a middle-aged woman with bright eyes and a notepad filled with questions. They spoke about the foundation, the programs, the company's shift toward sustainable technology. But as the conversation wound down, she asked one last question, one that silenced the room for a moment. "Mr. Vale, you've built an empire, lost people you loved, and rebuilt your life. What, in your opinion, changed you the most?" Ethan leaned back, glancing briefly at the photograph on his desk. Sophie's smile looked back at him, unchanged by time. But somehow it no longer hurt to see it. Instead, it reminded him of how far he had come, of the promises kept. He thought of Clara outside his office, now organizing his schedule, humming softly to herself, carrying light the same way Sophie once did, but in her own quiet way. He looked back at the interviewer, his voice calm but rich with emotion. "What changed my life the most," he said, "wasn't success or loss. It was what I found in someone else's drawer. It reminded me that the past doesn't need to disappear for the future to begin. Sometimes what you find isn't a secret, it's a second chance." The interviewer smiled, perhaps unsure of the full meaning, but sensing the sincerity. After she left, Ethan sat for a moment longer, absorbing the silence. He turned the photograph face up again, tracing the edges thoughtfully. "Thank you," he murmured to it, and meant it. That evening, after most of the staff had gone home, he found Clara standing by the window, watching the sunset. The city glowed beneath them, gold melting into violet. "Did it go well?" she asked without turning. "It did," he said. "I even sounded human, apparently." She laughed softly, still facing the skyline. "That's progress." He joined her, their reflections side by side in the glass. "Clara," he said quietly, "do you ever think about how strange it all was? That photograph, that moment, everything that brought us here." She nodded. "Every day. But I stopped trying to make sense of it. Some things aren't meant to be explained, they're meant to be lived." He smiled at her answer, feeling the truth settle deep in his chest. "Do you regret any of it?" She turned to him, finally, her eyes steady, her voice a whisper. "No, because even the pain had purpose." and because it brought you back to yourself. He looked at her then, not as the woman who had replaced someone else, but as the woman who had reminded him of the meaning behind every promise he'd ever made. "You did more than that," he said. "You brought me home." Outside, the last light of day faded over the Hudson, and the city began its nightly pulse. Inside, Ethan reached for her hand, not as an impulsive act, but as a truth long ready to be spoken. She didn't pull away. They stood there for a long time, two silhouettes framed against the living heartbeat of New York, neither needing to say the words both already knew. Months later, when Vail Technologies launched its scholarship initiative for young inventors from underprivileged backgrounds, Ethan gave a short speech at the gala. The ballroom was filled with people in shimmering gowns and tailored suits, but his words were simple. "Innovation isn't about creating something new," he said. "It's about remembering what was lost and finding the courage to build it again." Clara stood at the edge of the stage, watching him, pride shining quietly in her expression. When the applause faded and the crowd dispersed, Ethan found her near the balcony overlooking the city. "You hate parties," she teased. "You looked like you wanted to escape halfway through your own speech." "I didn't," he said. "Not when you were watching." She rolled her eyes lightly but smiled. "Smooth, Mr. Vail." "Ethan," he corrected softly. "It's Ethan." Her gaze softened and the noise of the gala dimmed until it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. "Ethan," she repeated, and the way she said his name made it sound like forgiveness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Before you panic," he said, half smiling. "It's not what you think. Not yet." She opened it carefully. Inside was a pendant, Sophie's seashell charm, now set in gold with a small sapphire at its center. "You've been carrying her memory long enough," he said. "I thought it was time it belonged to the future instead." Clara's eyes filled, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Finally she whispered, "This is beautiful." "So is what you've done for me," he said. "You showed me that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means making room for something new." She reached up, fastening the chain around her neck. "Then I'll wear it as a promise too," she said softly. "That love once found doesn't need to be hidden away." The night stretched on, full of laughter and quiet music, and when Ethan looked at her across the room, he saw not the shadow of his past, but the embodiment of everything he had been too afraid to hope for. Later, as they left the gala and walked along the river under the pale city lights, Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know," she murmured, "for a man who once built walls around everything you turned out to be pretty open." He smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "That's because someone showed me the beauty of unlocked drawers." She laughed, then light and free the sound, mingling with the hum of the city and the rhythm of the waves below. As they disappeared into the night, the camera of life might have lingered on the skyline, the tower standing tall, the river glistening, the city endlessly awake. And on Ethan Vail's desk, high above it all, the photograph remained. Two teenagers on a beach, long ago still holding hands, still laughing. But beside it now was another photo, Ethan and Clara, at the foundation opening, smiling with the same warmth, the same faith. The world had turned, but love had not ended. It had simply evolved. And as Emma's voice might have said, if narrating it to millions watching from around the world, sometimes what we find isn't just an object or a memory. It's a reminder that love never truly leaves it, just changes form and finds its way home. Before you go, take a moment to breathe in what this story left behind, the feeling that somewhere, in the quiet corners of our lives, love waits to be rediscovered, not as the fairy tale we once dreamed of, but as the truth that heals what was broken. If Ethan and Clara's journey touched something in you, if it reminded you of a face you still think of, or a promise you once made and lost along the way, let that memory stay for a moment before it fades into another scroll or another day. Because maybe that is what stories like this are for, not just to entertain, but to remind us that love, no matter how deeply buried, can find its way back through the smallest, most unexpected discoveries. A photograph, a scent, a song, a drawer half opened in the middle of an ordinary night. Every one of us has a story waiting to be seen, a chance waiting to return, and maybe this one was yours. I hope you felt the ache, the warmth, the redemption in it, the quiet courage it takes to let go of yesterday and believe that love can begin again in a different form. If this story moved you, please take a second to click like, because that tiny gesture tells me that what we share here reaches hearts beyond the screen. Share it with someone who might need a reminder that second chances exist, that forgiveness is still possible, that grief and love can live side by side without canceling each other out. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. What part made you pause? What line made you think of someone you once loved and maybe still do? Your words matter. They help this little storytelling family grow, connecting people from every corner of the world who believe in love's ability to heal. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are more stories like this, waiting, about loss, about hope, about the moments that change everything when we least expect it. You never know which one might find you next on a quiet evening when you need it most. Thank you for being here, for listening, for feeling. You make this space alive. Until next time, keep your heart open, because love often hides where we least think to look, sometimes in someone else's drawer, sometimes in our own.